We're going to pick up where we left off, and where we left off last week was with sampling. And so this week, we're going to be talking about realism. So beginning by striving for and then eventually departing from this idea of realism. What is realistic? Why are we trying to make something sound realistic? And why don't we? This is the very first question we're going to pose in this presentation. Why don't we just stick with samples? Because if you remember back to last week, what I was saying was sampling and multi-sampled instruments especially are pretty much the most real you can get. So the recording equipment is going to color the sound in some way, but those are the only variables. And for the most part, what you hear is then what you get. So for example, we have here this like Yamaha Neos piano. I actually don't know exactly what it's called. You can very easily search it because it is Alicia Keys' piano. And so Native Instruments went out and they created this multi-sampled instrument. And it sounds amazing. It's a really nice piano to use. And I'm not endorsed by Native Instruments. I just actually really happen to like this one. But this is what it says it is, right? This is the Yamaha Neos piano. This is Alicia Keys' piano, and they've gone to a lot of trouble to multi-sample that instrument. And in the modern day, with how powerful computers are, you can load up 20 instances of Contact in a project and use a bunch of these really large multi-sample libraries and have no problem composing music. So you might be wondering then, well, if sampling is the most real, why would we ever even want to use something else? Why don't we just stick to samples for everything? That's a great question, and one that we are going to be tackling and answering throughout this presentation. And with multi-sampled instruments, there are positives and there are negatives. There's never like this perfect world. It's so funny, in 2016, we still constantly complain about things as music producers or as sound designers. Like, we want this, we want that. But just imagine how difficult it was to make music like 15 or 20 years ago as compared to how easy it is now, but that's a discussion for another day. And the truth is, we can always find something to complain about. No matter how good it is, we always want something better. And I think the major downside of multi-sampled instruments is that it is what it is. So its positive is its strength. There are limits. You cannot edit the samples, right? This is Alicia Keys' piano. I can't turn a couple of knobs and suddenly have like some really aggressive dubstep wobble bass. I just can't do that. The samples are what they are. And the more you manipulate these samples, if we're thinking about realism, the less real it's going to sound. And so it defeats the purpose if realism is what we're going for. And this is the image I give you because I think that this is very much the reason why, what we'll get to the next slide, physical modeling exists. But you think about this, we have Alicia Keys' piano. We can't somehow convert that into a Steinway upright piano. They're going to sound totally different. And so you would need two different multi-sample libraries in order to get those two piano sounds. And us as music producers are like, well, we don't want to spend all that money on two different pianos if I'm only going to use it maybe one time ever for a particular production. So is there a solution? Well, there is a solution, but it's still a work in progress, at least in my opinion. And that solution would be physical modeling. So this is a very modern approach, and it's always getting better, but of course there are limitations. So over time with multi-sampling, we talked about this last week, it really evolved from where you might have a sound font with like 3 or 4 samples up to now the 100 gigabyte instruments we see today. It evolved, it got better to a point where it's just so real now that most listeners are not going to know that you've used a multi-sample library. They're going to think that that was a real piano that you recorded. And so physical modeling is currently going through its set of growing pains. And the limitation on physical modeling is the same sort of limitation that existed with creating multi-sample libraries. And it's just computing power. Really, it's CPU. They can come up with some really elaborate algorithms to try to model the physical characteristics of these instruments, but at what cost? You don't want to be bringing in one instrument and have it completely crash your computer. At that point, it makes more sense just to use multi-sample libraries. But the idea behind physical modeling, in really basic layman's terms, is that you're breaking down the acoustic components of an instrument. So how does that instrument actually work? How does it produce sound? And then you attempt to model those characteristics with algorithms as compared to sampling the actual instrument. So if we think about a piano in really basic terms, all we have is felt covered hammers, on each single note that go up and hit a string every time a note is pressed, every time a key is pressed down. That is the mechanism. It goes through like this trigger process. The hammer goes up, it strikes the string. The string then vibrates, which is going to sympathetically make the soundboard vibrate. That's why the piano exists inside of like this wooden container. That's really what's amplifying the sound. And boom, you have your piano sound. Now that sounds very simple, but there are actually millions and millions of variables with each and every piano, right? Like how thick is the wood? What type of wood is it? How long has this piano been sitting here? Are we going to try and emulate the aging process? What sort of felt is covering the hammer? What type of strings are being used? Is it double stringed? Is it triple stringed? We could go on and on forever and ever. And that's kind of where physical modeling right now is having to battle some things. Some things are going to have to be left out in order to make the instruments usable. So I think right now, when people talk about physical modeling, we normally think about this more in like an academic pursuit. So something that's being kind of studied and developed at a university system. But eventually, as the computers get even better, it's going to trickle down, and we're going to see some just really amazing, realistic physical modeled instruments, since this week is all about realism. And here is one example for you from Applied Acoustic Systems. They have some instruments inside of Ableton Live as well. But this is, I think, the only company that I can think of, maybe Piano Tech as well. I think that's a physical modeled instrument, and that one's pretty freaking elaborate. But this is one of the more popular and user-friendly options on the market. And here we're looking at String Studio. So if we go and we look at these different controls, we have things like the exciter. And so you can see, okay, are we going to have a pick be the thing that strikes the string? Do we want it to be a bow? Do we want it to be somebody's finger? I don't know what all of the options are. And then you have some additional controls and parameters that you can use. You can adjust the actual string itself. Is there a damper on the string? If you're going to the different sort of options. Let's skip past the filter real quick, and then we look over at the body. So as we talked about with the piano, like what sort of soundboard is being used? How is that string going to resonate and then ultimately produce sound? So something like this doesn't have any samples built into it. It's all being generated with algorithms. And so that is what you ultimately then kind of go through and control. And the benefit would be, okay, if I want to be able to create more of a, Steinway piano as compared to a Yamaha C7 piano, I could be able to do that. That's sort of where I think people are expecting physical modeling to go. Everybody's always saying it's getting a lot better, but I don't often see like new products coming out. So clearly it's still in more of an R&D phase right now. So physical modeling drawbacks, like I said, there's always positives, there's always negatives. And the big drawback are the variables. What will you and what won't you be able to model at the expense of the CPU? The other big criticism is that you can create these great algorithms, but algorithms don't really have soul or vibe like a lot of instruments do. Very rarely are physical models going to be attempting to emulate like an aging process on an instrument. And there's even just some like X factor things that you just are never going to be able to do with a computer algorithm. So you can argue sometimes that there's no soul or no vibe with an instrument. I'll leave that one up to you. It's sort of like people complain about all guitar multi-sampled libraries, saying that you can never emulate really effectively playing a guitar on a keyboard. It's just so different. So people complain about that a lot of times, and that's just multi-sampled libraries. So imagine what it would be like with physical modeling. Oftentimes, a very simple form of physical modeling is combined with other synthesis forms to create more experimental sounds. So with physical modeling, it doesn't just have to be about realism. You can depart from that. And really with physical modeling too, I think the original purpose or what people were thinking at the time was oftentimes experimental sounds, not necessarily realism. But obviously, when you think about the implications, realism is something that is going to come to mind immediately. Simple physical modeled instruments are very useful if you're interested in acoustics and instrument design, right? So you can look at something like the String Studio and start to think like, oh, okay, let's think about these different bodies and how they sound. And being able to have an instrument right there for you, I think helps connect some of those dots as compared to just reading about these materials and stuff in a book on like instrument design. So that's one of the things I really like about physical modeling is you can explain some concepts of how instruments make their sounds by breaking down these models and putting it into very simple terms. So this would be an example of an instrument that's about physical modeling, but really is more capable of experimental sounds. And what you have to be looking at is what's going on the bottom here. You can see we have a resonator and then we have a body, and we have a few controls that we can adjust with those. And while all the other things at the top are really just more like basic envelopes that you can use and route however you want. So I just wanted to show you that physical modeling, it's not just about realism, it's often about experimental sound design as well. All right, here's another example, a very basic physical model of a steam pipe. So you know if you blow into a pipe, it's going to make a noise. Think about a pipe organ, air goes shooting through it. There's a little lip in the pipe, and how that is shaped and how, the air is coming through, that's going to make the sound. And with this instrument, it's really almost using more or less like subtractive techniques to produce that kind of a sound, but it is considered a physical modeled instrument, and it's something we'll look at and talk about some of the controls on here. And then last but not least, another reactor ensemble. What is this one called? This is a pretty famous one that emulates a string sound. And again, we will look at it, and you can just see that I have a preset loaded up that's called pluck, but you'd have to look really closely here, and we'll do it in the actual context. But you can see there's a section for excitation, there's a section for string, for pickup, and then a lot of different effects, which oftentimes go hand in hand with physical modeling in order to get the sound to be a little bit more realistic, or to maybe cover up a few of the imperfections. But you can see with this preset loaded up, the CPU tax is 22%. And I'm not even playing anything. That's just to load up this ensemble. And is that really going to be something practical in a project? It is if I can bounce immediately, but the point of physical modeling is that you can go back and tweak settings as compared to being stuck with just samples. So already we have to ask that question of, is this something that would be practical to use as a music maker? That's not a question we're going to be tackling in this course, but just something to be aware of, especially with physical modeling. All right, so we have another solution for realism with sounds, and that solution would be additive synthesis. And in its most basic form, this is a very primitive synthesis method. In its most advanced form, it can be very modern, and I'd often argue this is a precursor to wavetable, to even just subtractive synthesis, because additive is the basis for the oscillator shapes, especially in the digital domain where you can create any kind of oscillator shape that you want. So let's break down additive synthesis and what it means, again, in very layman's terms. So our hearing ranges from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. What you can do with FFT analysis, which is fast Fourier transform, you can look it up. It doesn't really matter. You don't need to know that. But the idea behind that is that you can break down every single hertz. If I'm not sure if that would be how you refer to it properly, but let's call hertz a singular for hertz. And you can break down each of these, so 20, 21, 1000, 2000, 2012, whatever you want to use, and you can break each of those down into a sine wave. And from there, you go and you analyze a signal, and you generate sine waves either manually or with some kind of algorithm. And this will make more sense as we look at the actual example here. We start with a violin. A violinist goes across the strings, we record that audio file. From there, we analyze that file in some kind of spectrum analyzer, as you see in the bottom left, and we can then see that each of those little spikes is the equivalent of a hertz somewhere, and you can figure out what that is, and then you can take a bunch of sine waves, as I've done in the bottom right, and attempt to match that exact shape by changing the amplitude and getting all of the frequencies right. So in theory, if you were to do that perfectly, you would get the exact same sound. But that's just the theory. So let's go on and talk about additive and realism. I'm sure many of you can already see some problems with this. And apart from pipe organs, additive and realism, you don't really hear those two words used very often together, because if you think about it, the amplitude of all the sine waves, each of those sine waves is not going to be perfect. They're not all going to rise and fall at exactly the same time. And this is why when you create a string sound in a subtractive synthesizer with just one envelope, it doesn't sound as real as, the actual violin itself, because every single wave that's being generated is going up and down at pretty much the same time. You can use a filter, and that's why filters exist inside of subtractive synthesizers, so that maybe some at the top here are going to decay quicker, or you can bring more in right on the attack, whatever the case may be. But with additive, it's very, very difficult. In fact, basically impossible to get it just right. There are some algorithms that will kind of attempt to do it, but for the most part, I always think of additive as being something much more static. So we could recreate this wave by using these, using what we see on the spectrum analyzer. We could create that, but then we're kind of stuck with it. We can't really go any further beyond that point. So instead, additive in contemporary time serves an entirely different purpose, thanks in large part to the harmonic series. All right, so if we go back again and we look at this spectrum analyzer readout, there's a logic to where these different sine waves are falling, and that has to do with acoustics, and it has to do with how a string actually vibrates and the frequencies and the harmonics that are generated. And so with a string especially, you get a pretty nice harmonic series, which as we move forward here, we'll talk about it pretty simply here. The way you can think about the harmonic series is that basically every pitched instrument, so something that's supposed to play a pitch, follows some logic in how its sine waves are spread out and distributed across the spectrum. This is the basis for the common oscillator wave shapes. For example, a saw wave equals even and odd harmonics. And if we look at this, we have even and odd harmonics appearing. Whereas a square wave equals just odd harmonics, which is something that more brass instruments emulate. And this is why people say, all right, you want to go with a sine wave if you're going for strings, and you want to go with a square wave if you want to create something that's a little bit more brassy. And you can actually hear it in listening to it. It sounds a little bit more mechanical and a little bit more like technological when you're hearing those waves, like more industrial, just the raw saw wave or the raw square wave. But oftentimes you do kind of get a feel for, oh yeah, like this would be better if I wanted to go for more of a brassy sound or more of a string sound. In 2016, where most of us grow up working more with synthesizers than we do with actual sounds, oftentimes we think about it in reverse. It's sort of like, oh yeah, like that bassy sound kind of reminds me of the brass and not the other way around. But at the time when synthesizers were just coming out, that was the idea with those oscillators. And that is something we'll talk about when we move into subtractive synthesis. But in many sense, we can easily create any formula we want. It doesn't just have to be a saw wave or a square wave or a sine wave. Instead, this is often referred to as sine banks. So a bunch of different sine waves that you could kind of populate however you want. And that is still additive. Creating that sine bank is the additive portion, and then oftentimes you continue on and do subtractive methods beyond that with filters or whatever, but we're really more focused on just that additive portion of this, so creating that basic wave from which to begin. And you can see in this first picture we have Bitwig Studio's additive synthesizer, which is an organ, and with each of those different things you can pull up and down, it actually is adding or taking away particular harmonics and emphasizing some, or if it's low, not emphasizing others. And when we go in and look at this instrument, you'll see that it actually gives us these intervals very much related to the harmonic series. So we'll say like the octave, 2 octaves, perfect fifth, the 19th, whatever. And then we can see how this is being generated on a spectrum analyzer. All right, so that would be the first example. Second example is here inside of, I believe this is Serum, where you can draw in your own wave shape, or you can even bring up a formula. And in this case, we have a saw wave formula. And so we can see how this includes both even and odd ordered harmonics and the slope to which it's going down. So what you see on top is more of the spectrum analyzer, and what you see on the bottom would be the audio waveform, right? So if we bounced it out, we'd see that it looks like a sawtooth wave. And we can compare that then to a square tooth wave, which just has odd harmonics. So you can see the difference between the two here. And then we can create something ourselves. We can go in and we can actually randomize things. And the messier this looks, the more like noise it's going to sound. So the less, harder it will be to distinguish pitch. And if we just went in here and drew at complete random, we'd probably end up with more just of a noise type characteristics. But you can see that we get a lot of different options if we want that we can adjust. And it even gives you the ability to just generate a saw wave, which would be useful if then you want to go in and tweak it ever so slightly to create more of your own unique saw. And again, this would be the additive portion of this. So additive synthesizers. I think here's where we start to see that departure from realism, because additive synthesizers are absolutely capable of very unique sounds. And one of the most popular additive synthesizers is called Razor inside of Reactor. And when I go to Razor and I choose to use it, it's because I'm going for this very modern, slick, digital synth sound. I am not trying to emulate any kind of real-world instrument. It just wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. So apart from the quote-unquote oscillator, aka the sound generator section, additive synths tend to follow subtractive principles. So you use these sine banks and then you still go back to using filters and other things, which we will get to in later weeks. The benefit of additive is that you have a lot of control over the initial mix of sine waves you generate. So you're not just stuck with a saw wave. You're not just stuck with a square wave. You can create something unique to you. And typically these synths will sound a lot more digital, like very clean, very pristine. And that's because you are generating the initial sound from a perfect formula, not an imperfect physical oscillator. So when you have a subtractive synth, like I have a Novation bass station sitting here next to me, inside of that is an actual oscillator. It's a physical thing. And the fact that it's a physical component means that it's going to be imperfect, and it's going to carry with it a certain degree of distortion, right? Because the electricity is traveling through. There's always a distortion coefficient into that. And so it's not going to be perfect. But in the computer, it can be perfect. And that's why something like Serum, with the formulas you can put in, you listen to the saw wave in Serum and you compare it to the saw wave on, an actual physical subtractive synthesizer, and you go, these two things sound nothing alike, right? It's that formula versus the real world thing. And so you have to decide, when do I want to go with one versus the other? And those are not questions we're tackling in this course, but will be things we talk about at great length on this website in the future, because that's really what music production is all about, finding the things that are going to fit. So here's one example. This is called Laser Bass. This is a really fun reactor ensemble. And if you look over to the oscillator section, you can see we have full saw, but we can adjust like the partials. So if we want to have like the full-blown saw wave, we can go all the way up on that, or we can bring it down. And then as you see, there's some other options that are built into the oscillator, like attenuation, like what sort of other things do you want? And this will be a fun instrument to look at when we actually get to it. But then there's a ratio multiplier and these things, and all of that is going to adjust the formula that you have with that initial starting block. So it's a little bit confusing to just look at it here in a picture. We will be talking about it in much greater depth and focusing on those sine banks that are being generated. And then this is the big one. This is the very popular instrument. You've probably heard it in a lot of music. This is Razor. And so I've gone into the little oscillator section, and you can see that there are a variety of things that you can choose. And then you oftentimes get additional controls. So with the format here, I have the option to go in and change a few different parameters in it as I see fit. And actually, this also has more of like a wavetable vibe to it. If you look down at oscillator 2, a pulse to saw. So that's something that can easily be done with additive. We even have a ratio control and a color control, and these things adjust that balance of sine waves. So it'll be a lot of fun when we look at that in the flesh. And this one's capable of making just some great sounds anyway. So even if you just want to hear cool sounds, you'll get that here. Okay, samples as sound source. So we're taking kind of a right turn here, and we're going to talk about using samples as the basis for, the synth sound that then gets used. So when we think about the multi-sampled instrument in the piano, We're loading it up because we want a piano. Well, now we're loading up a sample and we want it to go through some kind of crazy elaborate process to get us a totally different sound. So this is now the more experimental territory where we're taking a very extreme departure from realism. And so some examples where samples are used as a sound source or as a synthesis method would include things like granular, wave scan, and micro sampling. And with these methods, the original sample is repurposed or manipulated to such an extreme that recognizing the original source is often impossible, but not always. We'll talk about how you can still recognize it, but it just sounds as if it's very synthetic, right? Sort of like a vocoder type deal there. These sort of techniques can be very useful for textures, drones, or experimental sound design. They're not as useful for leads, basses, or other pitched instruments, oftentimes because tuning becomes so difficult. You're loading in a sample and then it's running through all sorts of complex processes. How do you get that sample to then be in tune? That's oftentimes your biggest problem here. Doesn't mean that these methods are not useful and can't make some really interesting music. They're just not going to work usually in a Western harmonic sense. Okay, so here's just a couple of examples. We have the Travelizer. This is a wave scan synthesizer where you can kind of go through a sample and do all sorts of really fun stuff with it. This is one of my favorite instruments of all time, really, and it's a great example of how samples can be repurposed and used beyond just a realistic sense. And then here in Absinthe, we have a granular function. You don't really see granular too often. I think Ableton Live has some kind of granular thing built in. I know with Max for Live, a lot of people make granular stuff. Inside of Reactor, there are some granular ensembles, but they usually include other things. The reason I'm going to show you Absinthe is because it's so basic in what granular functions it does provide. Whereas most other instruments that give you a granular feature, it goes really in depth. There's a granular option inside of Alchemy if you're a Logic user. So it's out there, but not many people are using it in their popular music, at least not at this moment, maybe in the future. Okay, so let's wrap this presentation up here. And I want to wrap it up by talking about the main idea for this course. All right, this isn't about telling you necessarily what to use and what not to use. We're analyzing the different methods, but the point is everything is out there and it's all available to you. You need to pick the instrument that best suits your needs when you are actually making music. And so the great hypothetical question we can ask is, do you want real strings or do you want synthesized strings? That's a question I'll ask you a lot of times, and it's not literal. This could be for any sort of a sound. The point is, you now know that multi-sampled libraries exist, and they can be very realistic. But you also now know, okay, there's physical models of strings, right? So which do I want to use? Or do I want to use something totally different? Do I want to create a harmonic series that's similar to what a string would be, right? Do we want to go down that road and then use other subtractive processes to shape the sound further? It's nowadays, it's all about trying to find the sounds that fit because all of the sounds are out there. All right, so I'm looking forward to this week. It's going to be so much fun, and I hope that you learn about new synthesis methods that you never thought existed or that you never thought were really going to, or you thought were just outside of your comprehension, because they're all very simple once you break them down piece by piece, and that's exactly what we'll be doing in the remainder of this section. Thanks a lot.